During the events of the crappening, or the happening if you prefer, the plants are finally ready to take back the surface of the planet. Humanity has had it too good for too long apparently, and because of our massive expansion across the surface of this world, it has led us to have some less than ideal encounters with the native flora and their subsequent response, which actually sort of makes sense. When a species is threatened on a large scale, usually adaptations will arise to protect that species from the aggressor. We have seen this with the bacteria being attacked by viruses and developing CRISPR. We see it with fungus attacking bacteria, to which the bacteria will develop antibiotic resistances because I guess everybody just likes ganging up on bacteria. But we've also seen it with humans being attacked by wolves, to which we annihilated almost the entire species before realizing that they were kind of a part of a complex food web and were quite necessary. Life itself is nothing more than a reaction to other forms of life and changes in the environment. Considering we use trees to build houses, clear cut them in droves to make usable land, and in general just burn them up for firewood, it's not like trees really have an understanding of what they're being used for, but with their mass interaction with humanity, eventually a biological defense would be formed to keep us away from them by taking us out. Which, if you want to know something that's actually interesting, chili peppers' chemical burning sensation is supposed to stop us from eating them, but it doesn't. Caffeine is poisonous to a lot of animals and the coffee bean, but we drink it anyhow. Humans are just kind of weird. But in the happening, humans are the primary target for a mysterious biological concoction that overrides our self-preservation instincts and forces us to take ourselves out. So in today's episode, we will talk about what this chemical is, how it affects our brains, and how plausible it may be, because there's actually something inside of us, a rather interesting phenomenon that we really don't understand all that well today, which this may be co-opting. All right, let's get to it. But first, this episode is sponsored by No, it's not sponsored by anyone. So, okay, moving on for real now. So as per usual, we will jump into a summary of this movie before getting to the science for all those who haven't seen it yet. Someone mentioned in the last video, I didn't have like a timestamp up to where to jump ahead to, so really it was kind of sort of a running poll to see if anyone actually does jump ahead, as I can't tell from the analytics, but it seems that some people do. So up on screen, you'll see a timestamp to jump to bypass this masterpiece of a movie, but come on now. Who wouldn't want to see Marky Mark, formerly part of the Funky Bunch, in this acting? It's beautiful. But on a serious note, this did hurt me on a physical level to watch. I just don't remember it being this bad. So we open up our story with two friends sitting on a park bench in Central Park. The blonde is discussing with her friend that she can't really remember what page she was on. This confusion is something that we will see flourishing throughout the movie, as this is the first stage of the toxin entering the brain. As her friend reminds her about what page she was on, they hear a scream, and then see some people clawing at themselves and standing in the park motionless. Her friend continues to request information as to what page she was on, as her friend looks at her kind of confused. Eventually the blonde pulls out a hair pick thing, I don't know what that is, and jams it into her neck, puncturing her trachea and esophagus. Ow. Further in the city, the toxin is just arriving as a group of construction workers are standing around. You know, as construction workers do, and I can say that because I used to do construction. It's really just one guy working and 6 guys watching. As Mr. Popular finishes up his joke, someone then falls to their end. Checking on him, they hear another person fall just behind them. Realizing this isn't a normal set of events, and these people aren't just falling, they look up to see that all the workers located on top of the building are jumping off to their end, ensuring that something terrible appears to be happening. Ha! Anyways, all over the city. Jumping further away, we meet with our teacher and main character named Elliot, a Brooklyn street tough, wait, wrong movie, a kind and friendly teacher who is discussing about the mass disappearances of bees all over the world. He asks his class why this may be happening, as everyone throws out their ideas relating to pollution, to global warming, to climate change in general. Man, I've been really doing a lot of these movies lately on climate change. To which Elliot remarks that it could be any one of those things, but it's bad nonetheless, and humans are likely to blame. As he discusses with his students, the vice principal shows up and gathers the teachers up. They are releasing the students as some sort of attack seems to have been carried out on Central Park, and in the city though, nobody is sure as to what it actually was. Heading outside, Julian, Elliot's friend, begins talking to him about his wife and how she wasn't ready to get married yet. They also discuss what maybe Julian should do to round up his family, and that it takes really a backseat to the wife conversation. Elliot doesn't know why everyone keeps kind of having the same conversation with him, but as he heads home, we know why. His wife Alma is just a sort of trash person in general, and she's been meeting up with other dudes to eat tiramisu. Remember everyone, don't be an Alma. Loyalty above all. Regardless, as she watches the news, Elliot comes in and begins packing. The chief medical correspondent on the television begins discussing how this appears to be the markings of some sort of neurotoxin, and that it can stop the brain from firing in a certain way and override the self-preservation instincts that we all possess. Pretty good thinking, really, as she's actually pretty spot on. The issue is, however, they don't know what's causing it and assume it to be an isolated event. Despite this, Elliot thinks that they still need to get out of Dodge and decide to head to the train station to GTFO from the populated areas. As the train leaves with them on board, the city they were just in starts starts displaying a lot of the same symptoms as New York. As trees sway in the wind, a cop is talking to a cab driver as everyone around stops in their tracks. Interestingly, the dogs are not affected. The cop then ends up doming himself, which, if you think about it, that's an incredibly difficult way to hold a force multiplier against your skull. Like, hold your arm out in that position right now and try to like face it to yourself. How uncomfortable is that? Anyhow, everyone in the area starts doming themselves too, one by one, as the train continues to leave the area. On board, Slagathor, known as Alma, starts to kind of talk to the dude who she had tiramisu with and tells him he needs to chill out. Nah, gal, maybe you should chill out. But this dude tells her that it also happened in Philadelphia and they were just attacked. Julian calls his wife and she seems okay, but he can't really hear her as she just got on a bus heading towards a hell on earth known as New Jersey. Elliot goes to Alma and she tells him Boston was just hit too. As they continue to ride the train, eventually it just starts coming to a stop in a small town known as Filbert. Everyone gets off and the conductors say they have to stop as they have lost communication with everyone. The height of Marky Mark Funky Bunch acting is right here, by the way, and the dialogue doesn't even match the event, and it was amazing. So things aren't looking so good as you might imagine, and everyone heads into the diner to discuss what they should do. Eventually, a woman receives a video of a zoo attendant jumping into a lion's cage that was only about 90 miles from there. Then the TV broadcast comes on, and the new running theory is this isn't a coordinated event, but something else entirely. After mentioning its proximity, everyone then nopes out hardcore. Elliot tries to get a ride for his group, but before he's able to, Julian then approaches him saying that he needs to go make sure his wife is okay. He asks him and Alma, you know, the power couple, to take his daughter and watch after her should anything happen to him. He jumps in a Jeep and then takes off to New Jersey, which, you know, this thing is hitting cities. Why would you go to New Jersey? Anyhow, another man who owns a plant nursery agrees to take Elliot's group, but first he needs to stop off and get something from his house. When they arrive, man, this dude lives like really close to a nuclear power plant, but he decides to begin discussing how plants can feel humans by the way we talk and interact with them. If you talk to them kindly and calmly, it makes the plant feel better, which according to some studies may actually be somewhat true, but it's not 100% confirmed if this is the case. Anyhow, back at Julian's group, they round a corner and oh man, everyone is just hanging out. The woman starts to scream as then they try to close the vents to make sure no air is coming through the windows. This woman is literally in an enclosed car screaming, which I imagine is mega annoying. Like, yes, we all see them. So Julian comes up with a math puzzle to keep her focused. As he tells her about it, he looks up and sees that there is a hole in the roof, which my first instinct is, I don't know, maybe put like a shirt or something to close it off, but he sort of just looks at it like, dude. Anyways, so it's straight up letting in neurotoxin as the driver stops and then floors it into a tree, which sends him and the woman flying out through the windshield. Julian then exits the car, sits on the ground, and begins slicing his wrist with some sort of glass that he found, which likely leads to his end as well, because we don't ever see him again. Back at Elliot's group, they are faring a little better than Julian's. They drive down some back roads and eventually run into a soldier, which they assume they're now safe. Not sure how they arrived at this conclusion though. The soldier mentions how the base is seemingly infected as soldiers were in the barbed wire and taking themselves out left, right, and center. As they discuss where to go, others begin arriving and they decide that they need to group up. The soldier mentions how everyone needs to go to a safe area, which seems unaffected, and talks about how they should break up into two groups for what appears to be based on nothing. Those that are ready to go now and those that need to get stuff from their car are going to be the two groups. So they split up and then start walking in the groups, with Elliot's group being the smaller one. I wonder if that turn of luck will actually pay off. Oh, by the way, Elliot realizes Julian is toast and so does his daughter, so congrats on that surprise adoption. Anyhow, as the group walks through a field, the larger group suddenly has half of it stop, with a woman screaming and the soldier yelling about his force multiplier, which likely means that something was drilled into his brain during basic and now is coming out for no reason. He begins walking backwards as the other half of the group realizes that the jig is up and everyone starts taking themselves out of the game. The smaller group that was lagging behind has this really weird moment. Like, they are all demanding Marky Mark tell them what to do, and I'm not really sure how he got thrusted into the leadership role, but it's quite literally like they don't know what to do at all. Elliot then comes to the conclusion that the group ahead is already gone as Alma screams about not being a bystander. Elliot then has an epiphany that it's the size of the group causing the plants to react. That's why it didn't really happen to them, but they need to stay ahead of the wind, which, by the way, look at this freaking wind. Never in my life have I seen wind react this way unless you're in like a tornado. Just kind of made me laugh how aggressively it's helping the plants. So at this point, Elliot and the smaller group decide that they need to split up even further, so that they do not arouse the attention of the plants, and they go their separate ways. Elliot eventually finds a radio in a truck, and the radio mentions how it's probably some leak from the government facilities. Then Elliot sees a house in the distance, which the rest of the group sees it too, and they decide to go check it out. They raid this house for a map in an attempt to figure out where they should go and who's got the least amount of population, which I'm gonna be real with you, it looks like this town was already hit, so there should be like no one there, so why not stay in this house? Well, that'll come up later, and Elliot then talks to a plastic plant for a while, and they decide to bounce out to an even more isolated area. Eventually, Elliot does begin talking to the kid known as Josh and Jared, and he begins to discuss how the primordial bacteria has begun showing up all over and taking out fishermen, that in reality, the planet may be having some sort of defense against humanity. They decide to leave the house a little later on, which, okay, I guess it was a good idea, as two large groups arrive, which activates the almonds of the plants, and the toxin is released, and then some dude gets run over by a lawnmower. Then we see the most unrealistic thing possible in this movie. So currently, what I have found is like 2 bedrooms, needs renovations, and it's like $400,000. Realtors are saying it's the worst time in about 15 years to buy a house, because apparently it's a massive seller's market. But look at the size of those houses for $300,000. Why is everything so expensive? Just thought I'd complain about that for a minute. So we haven't seen a scene with people biting the dust in over about 2 minutes at this point. So Elliot decides to approach a house and ask for some food, as they're starting to feel kind of fairly hungry. Walking up to the house, the 2 younger kids, Josh and Jared, begin trying to break in. From inside of it, the owners of the home have barricaded it to keep out people as well as the poison gas. This makes the young teenagers very angry because, well, they're teenagers, and sometimes when you are that age, you can be notoriously dumb. The owners don't care, however. As Elliot tries to tell them that everything is okay and the air is fine, a barrel exits the front door and blows away Josh. Now, your first instinct when that happens should basically be to dodge, dip, duck, dive, and dodge. The 5 Ds of not being filled with lead. Jared, however, missed the memo and then takes one to the dome also. The owners then say they have 10 seconds to get off his porch before he attacks the others, to which Elliot, Alma, and Jess take off running. So at this point, what is happening has caught the attention of the entire US and likely the planet. 2 older women in particular have like the right idea, wearing masks to block out the toxins, as news reports mention how because of the increasingly intense toxicity, it should peak rather soon, saying by 9 a.m. tomorrow, which, I mean, it's still a neurotoxin. Like, even if it peaks, unless it's broken down extremely quickly, I would still say it's going to exist within the environment. So it's not like really 9:01 a.m. timing, you're just good to go. Anyways, as they continue their trek to find anything abandoned, Elliot's remaining group finds a house owned by a woman named Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones seems to not really be there and is kind of unnaturally standoffish, which is good in this event as she's gone completely off the grid and on her own and doesn't live anywhere near anyone. She takes in Elliot, Alma, and Jess, but tentatively, and continues to accuse them of either trying to steal her stuff or take her out in her sleep. Eventually the next day, it comes to a head when Elliot is in a room by himself and she finds him demanding that they leave immediately. He runs outside to talk to her, but oh no, she's walking backwards. The toxin has even found this small of a group, which I do want to break off for just 1 second. There was this idea floating around that this actually isn't a neurotoxin, it's mass hysteria, but then Mrs. Jones throws a wrench into that whole ideology because she is by herself. She doesn't even know what's happening. She doesn't know about, she has no radio, she has no way to contact the outside world. She just does her own thing, and even she is affected by this. So I think the whole, oh, it's mass hysteria, the dancing fever of like 1886 or some crap like that. No, this is a neurotoxin. It has nothing to do with mass hysteria. Anyhow, Elliot runs inside as Mrs. Jones starts smashing her face against the walls of the house and eventually breaking the windows, allowing the toxin to get into the house. Seeing as he doesn't want to be bodied, Elliot locks himself in the back room and then covers up the cracks of the door. He hears Alma and Jess, who were out in the shed for some reason, and then begins talking to them through the pipe and telling them to close the doors and windows, which, judging by that door, I'm gonna say the real miracle here is that they didn't just get infected in the shed. Elliot continues to talk to them, and as he does, he basically says screw it because he has no idea how long this is going to last, and he says he just wants to be with them. He heads outside to meet his fate, or so he thinks. He isn't immediately ended, and Alma and Jess come outside as well. They meet up and then go back into the house and decide to just wait a bit longer to see what happens. And this is where the whole ideology of like, oh, it's mass hysteria because they accept their fate and it didn't really happen comes into play, but it's total crap. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, there's a difference between like, oh, I'm gonna dance because the rest of the group is dancing, and then literally throwing yourself off a building because you see your friend do it. Like, it's absolutely neurotoxin. Anyhow, 3 months later, they're back in Philadelphia with everything appearing much more thinned out concerning population. Jess is getting ready for her first day of school, and Alma realizes that she's pregnant. Elliot walks Jess to the bus as a news report begins discussing how they may have just seen a warning from the plants and that it could happen again. The media, being being the media, basically dribbles from its own mouth about how it's basically just hogwash because, you know, the journalists went to school for their medical degrees and know everything about diseases and outbreaks, and their opinions on matters should be held as law, apparently. But the doctor who did go to medical school protests on how this could happen again, but we won't listen to him. And now it's Europe's time to play with the plants. In France, and that rhymed just in time, as two friends walk down a path in a park, one keeps repeating how he should drop his bike off after work as his friend looks around after hearing a scream and see, oh no, it's happening. So with that summary wrapped up and done, we have to wait about 2 seconds literally to screw with everyone who jumped ahead. So Matt, put a jump off point right here before I start talking, and 2 seconds of silence. Go. So anyways, that's why Marky Mark embezzled funds directed at creating neurotoxins in trees, as mentioned halfway through the summary, actually in real life. And when M. Night heard about this, it resulted in the creation of this movie happening. So what exactly was Mark trying to accomplish with this idea though? Well, like any idea anyone would really want to talk about, we first must understand the effects of neurotoxins and what it has on us, but even prior to that, we have to talk about, most importantly, plants' reactions to humans and whether they be favorable or unfavorable. Throughout all of human history, someone, somewhere, had to eat a plant to let the rest of us know it was poisonous. Likely this stemmed from, say, Unga saying, hey Bunga, does this mushroom look good to you? And then eating it, which either resulted in it being slightly satiated, if you like mushrooms, tripping for several hours if it was a special type of mushroom, which must have been horrifying considering there are saber-tooths prowling around, or just straight up flatlining, to which Bunga would go on to remember that that plant took out Unga. Trial and error is rough, but the whole point of this tirade is that something we all know. Sometimes plants just create compounds that even if it's not supposed to react with humanity, it can still screw with our metabolisms and salt exchanges to the point that we end up taking a dirt nap. I mean, even now, to anyone who's down south, we are getting absolutely inundated with pollen, like the most pollen I have ever seen. Everything is yellow, and there are literal green, yellow clouds in the sky, and the body of pretty much anybody is having quite a reaction to it. My wife is actually breaking out in hives just from going outside, whereas I'm still able to walk around with no allergy medication, but I'm still coughing a lot, and it's not because of the virus. Anyways, so the concept here is that the plants can create compounds that can quite easily interact with your body, whether it be in a meaningful way or completely accidental. Some compounds you may know that are meaningful interactions are pretty hilarious. For instance, spices that we use to kind of eat spicy food or spice our food, that's really a defense mechanism, like I've mentioned earlier, for a plant to ward off animals that would eat them. And, well, we do it anyways. Chocolate can take out dogs, but humans can eat it, and we eat a lot of it. And, you know, the biggest one, again, coffee, for a lot of animals is poisonous, but I literally, as I'm recording this, I'm drinking it for energy. Also, did you know fresh cut grass smell is something a lot of people seem to enjoy, but it's actually the grass releasing stress hormones into the air as it's being attacked by something that literally just cut it in half. Basically, humans are just a wild card thrown into the evolutionary pathway because while there are absolutely plants that can take us out, the reality is we can even sometimes develop tolerances to that. In the happening, however, there is no ability to develop a tolerance to the chemical compound that the plants are using. And it's mentioned that it could just be the trees, but from further discoveries and the events as they continue to unfold, it's discussed that it could also be in the grass, bushes, basically every plant is releasing this toxin into the air. So first things first, how is this released? Well, there's a reason I mentioned both pollen and stress hormones of plants. What seems to be the most feasible route to take would be a hormone produced from a plant, which would kind of be a defense hormone that co-opts possibly the same pathways as the pollinating abilities. It appears to take place in either late spring or possibly early summer when plants are actually still releasing pollen to varying degrees. As the main pollinating event has concluded and the lower level is reached, which is usually the pollen we can't see, this neurotoxin is seeded into the air into an area where humans would have the largest interaction with these plants, the northeast. With the sheer amount of people touching, cutting, standing next to, pulling out of the ground, and in general just harassing plants, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to believe at this point that a tree that has its leaves cut month after month, or a bush that has been ripped out of the ground and thrown somewhere else and then was able to maybe start, sending down roots and surviving again, they would actually attempt to develop a defense against whatever is causing it, which in the environment would indicate humans. It must be based purely on interaction as well, seeing as the epicenter begins, which is Central Park. Likely well manicured, as I've never really been, this would be the most harassed plants likely in the entire state, as probably only a few plants' defense mechanisms flow through the air. It then hits humans, but no other animal, meaning that it was really only meant to have an ability to affect the pathways of the brains in humans. As it does this, considering it's a pollen, it may also possess a genetic map for other plants to create their own defenses to humans, which is able to jump species of plants. This is a little far-fetched, as typically plants do not sort of communicate with one another in this way, or really have much interaction with one another, but regardless, if this all sounds ridiculous, just remember, plants have been using animals pretty much since we formed. You ever wonder why fruit exists? It's so animals can eat the fruit and seeds, walk away, and deposit it somewhere else in manure, which is ready-made food for the seed. Now the question is then, do plants know about humans? To a degree, this would mean that, yes, they do. A species began making fruit, which then attracted a certain animal through interactions, and this allowed it to become more successful, and now we have orange juice in the morning. There are some plants that mimic the smell of rotting flesh that attracts flies to spread pollen, and others smell really sweet, which attracts bees. The core of this is, why do they do this? Again, because plants to a degree are aware of animals. So what makes us any different then? Well, that's just it. It doesn't. Considering plants are using animals as a benefit to their own species, when one in particular becomes a nuisance, it's pretty clear the answer is to just straight up poison that species, annihilating it from the local area, which is what plants actively do. And this is hence why we have poisonous plants. So now let's go on to what this particular poison does to the mind of a person and why it may not be entirely ridiculous, because it's simply co-opting something a lot of people already have in them concerning taking themselves out. And just as a heads up, we're going to start treading into some hypothesis and not entirely understood science of the mind, because unfortunately we do not know everything there is to know about the 3-pound chemoelectric anxiety machine located in our skulls quite yet. As the toxin wafts through the air, it's clear the first place it would enter is through our noses or lungs as we breathe. Should it enter the lungs or lining of our mouths and throats, it would diffuse into the bloodstream heading towards the brain. This may take a little longer, so the mouth breathers of the world might actually last a few more seconds. And this may be why we see people literally notice everyone stopping around them as they sit there, as it's still pumping through their body, but it hasn't quite gotten to the brain yet. But this will definitely happen shortly. Those who breathe through their noses, or were currently doing so when the first wave of toxin hit them, would likely have it diffused through the nasal tissue and into the olfactory bulb of the brain. We know as of late this is extremely possible given the current virus we are dealing with, which results in loss of sense of taste and smell. As it enters the olfactory bulb, it would likely cause misfirings within the bulb itself, considering it has the ability to disrupt the firing of neurons. This location is actually fairly critical because of the location and the way the brain is structured. As toxin continues to diffuse through the brain, it would continue to stop certain firing patterns or block specific chemicals within the brain, and we call these chemicals neurochemicals. But I see one main culprit in my mind that the toxin would likely attack. But before we get to that, let's continue on our pathway of the actual attack itself. With the lower portion of the brain misfiring, it would likely also to a degree have an effect on the frontal lobe, because there's no reason to think that it honestly wouldn't, given its neurotoxic abilities, be able to do this. And this is where we begin to see our first symptoms arise. People begin repeating themselves over and over again. Now, usually this would indicate an issue with the Broca's area located just behind the frontal lobe and near the olfactory bulb, which the frontal lobe is near the olfactory bulb. But given that it's still a full sentence at first, the first symptom is confusion. This person repeats themselves and looks confused as the frontal lobe begins misfiring or not firing in the correct patterns. Then, as quickly as it sets on, the toxin begins spreading into the brain of the aforementioned Broca's area just behind the frontal lobe. We see the person at this point begin to have difficulty speaking. As the area becomes more and more affected, they seem to stop talking entirely. What's even more interesting is you can see this in real time. You can actually plot their symptoms and see the brain being affected by this toxin moving from the olfactory bulb backwards. As the toxin continues to press on, it would begin affecting the lower portions of the brain, and here's where the issues begin to arise for a person on a survival level. The lower portions of the brain near the brainstem are said to house our survival instincts. Deeply rooted, it's said to be the lizard brain. Then moving past that to the mammalian, then ultimately to our primate brains, which is our huge cerebrum. Someone recently brought up that the lizard brain doesn't actually exist, and after looking into it, the best way I can summarize it is that these pieces of the brain in their current state have always existed, but they have changed in size, location, and structuring. So a fish has the same brain parts as a lizard, which has the same brain parts as a human, but how they are structured is different. So I gotta say, man, I can't remember who it was, but that was actually a fairly interesting read, so thank you for posting that to me. But I think the whole lizard brain point is really what it's trying to accomplish, is basically in what appears to be the oldest part of the brain are the survival instincts, so lizard brain. At least that's how I view it. Anyways, whereas our ability to think and reason with our larger cerebrums is a primate trait, that appears to be mainly unique to us, at least in this capacity. Anyhow, so with this toxin now reaching the lower portion of the brain, or the limbic system, it would be shut off due to issues communicating, which would also start to cause a whole host of emotions and instincts being basically shut down, which means kind of what keeps you alive starts to get shut down. For instance, the hypothalamus basically controls a lot of feelings of exhilaration, anger, unhappiness. The amygdala controls aggression, fear, and also has a hand in anger as well. And the basal ganglia is responsible for initiating movement. And these are all areas that should specifically be affected. It's a big problem, but the basal ganglia being affected by something, this as a result can cause you to actually have a rigid, stiff, shuffling walk, which is quite important to the whole thing concerning this brain interaction. It's clear the lower portions of the brain are being affected due to the fact that all emotion leaves a person's face once the toxin has affected this part of the brain, which a big thing is also fear. But as we have seen with the soldier, he begins yelling about his force multiplier, which was clearly something that was ingrained in his mind when the Broca's area became affected, which is sort of like the last firing or the last basically correct firing of those neurons. But as it went deeper into his brain, he begins walking backwards rigidly and with difficulty, which is something we have seen in others, almost like their nerves are now firing in a reverse pattern or completely out of sync with one another, as clearly there is something going on that he really, or really anybody, can't control. Moving further back into the brain, we eventually end up in the Wernicke's area, and this is responsible for speech recognition. As far as we have seen, any attempts to talk to a person out of doing whatever they were trying to do to end themselves is largely unsuccessful. They may be able to understand you at first, even with all the confusion in their mind, but they wouldn't even be able to understand your speech after a few moments, as anything you say quite literally falls on deaf ears. In fact, people who have had strokes in this area have cited that they could understand people one moment, and then the next, it's like they were speaking a different language entirely and couldn't make sense of anything anyone was saying. Pretty freaky. But all of this, the misfirings, the movements, the yelling, it all really hinges on a likely interaction with the body of a person, and more specifically the nervous system of a person. And in nature, neurotoxins do not exist naturally. They have to be created by man, but we are a part of nature too, and if we can create it, likely through trial and error, another species could potentially create something similar to a nerve toxin without it exactly being like what we have. What I believe is happening is what the movie is actually mentioning is that this nerve toxin isn't like anything we have created, but a naturally occurring version of what we have created, which means that it could have similar effects, but not completely the same. This can be seen in how the ones we have created can be infecting people in seconds, diffuse through the skin of a person, and then enter your motor neurons. They block acetylcholinesterase, which is an enzyme responsible for the breakdown of acetylcholine, which causes your nerves to fire. As this continues to build up in the nervous system with no enzymes arriving to allow the muscles to relax, this can cause you to suffocate and shut down your ability to move, as well as stop your heart pretty quickly, all while you're just kind of trapped there. It's pretty nasty stuff. This may explain, however, how it's possible for it to diffuse across barriers so easily. Most clearly in the nasal passages concerning what we have seen in the happening, it can enter the brain of a person, but it may also be able to easily move past the blood-brain barrier of a person, which is the absolute perfect way to be carried through the brain quickly, as it's able to kind of begin amassing in areas wreaking havoc on those specific portions of the brain. So the natural version of a nerve toxin clearly doesn't cause this to happen to motor neurons, but instead it appears to specifically affect the nerves within the brain itself and does not appear to have a great impact on motor neurons at all. This is likely due to its infection route, and ultimately the toxin locking up your body may have been originally intended, but because humans became equipped with this quirky little addition to our brain that is absolutely baffling as to why we have it, this is what ended up taking us out. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever stood atop a tall building or a cliff's edge and thought to yourself, jump? Not that you want to meet your end, because if you do, I would highly recommend getting some help, but for those average people whose lives aren't too bad and everything's okay and they're mentally a good place, roughly 50% of the population have said, yeah, I've had this feeling. I mean, I have it every time I approach somewhere up high too, and there are other versions of this as well. The strangest one being that, like, when you're handed a baby, your brain thinks, yo, I could totally spike this into the ground. Or when you're driving on a highway, you start to think about jerking the wheel. This is referred to as the call of the void. The call of the void is something that isn't largely understood yet, but there are a few lines of thinking as to what it could be. The first line of thinking is that your brain is preparing you for the absolute worst case scenario. The brain doesn't like to be surprised by outcomes. So when you hold a baby, the obvious most detrimental thing you could do in your social standing and with loved ones, as well as your group survivability endeavors, which is ingrained in all of us, would be to harm a newborn. If you jump off a cliff, well, that's obviously not very good for your life expectancy either, and it's the same as wrecking a car or jumping off a building. So your brain makes you think about these things whether you want to or not, because it's the most awful thing your brain can imagine, and as a result, when you survive it or don't do it, congrats, you got past the worst case scenario because it went better than expected. The other thinking on this is really that the brain is immediately uncomfortable. Now, holding a newborn may not really stack up so well with this thinking, but say you approach a cliff and have the desire to jump. Your brain is thinking, hey, I hate heights, and because I hate heights, I want to get down immediately. And the quickest way down is straight down. Now, the other part of your brain, the more rational part, is like, whoa, 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 man, like, you can't just jump, that'll annihilate us. Let's slowly descend, as that makes way more sense. And then you walk down the path and boom, you're down from the cliff's edge. Same with buildings, and the same idea can be applied to driving on a highway. Going fast at some level may make you uncomfortable. Call of the void likely exists in a large percent of the population, likely over 50% of the mark, because it must serve some sort of purpose to exist and to have propagated, which likely means it's in most of us. It's also believed that call of the void may originate from the instinctual part of the brain as well, but it's actually a sign of being well adjusted, so don't worry about it. Just stay in control of your emotions, because remember, you control your actions, your feeling doesn't control your actions. But I think this may be what's going on with the people in the happening to a degree. Take the woman, for instance, with the hairpin thing. Again, I have no idea what to call it, but she's at the beginning. Her call of the void was, oh man, wouldn't this suck if this went into my neck? Well, with her brain misfiring and this originating somewhere deep within her mind, the logical part of her mind is no longer able to override the call of the void, and her brain takes the worst case scenario as the literal scenario that she needs to do, because there's nothing logical there to override that level of thinking. Now, I used to do construction, but I hated heights. Yet I found myself on half-built skyscrapers all the time, near an edge, working on some concrete. It's pretty clear the feeling I had in my head at that point was, yo, Roanoke, you should totally jump and see what it's like. Now, logically, it was pretty easy to not do that, but it was a strange pressure I felt as long as I was on top of a tall building. Eventually, it did subside as more time was spent on top of tall buildings, but it has since returned since I no longer frequent tall buildings. The guy driving the Jeep may feel what we all feel when we are going too fast, and a slight fear arises within him, and then also telling him to crash. Again, with no logical portion of his brain checking these feelings, they're free to run rampant, and when your body actually carries out these orders through the areas at least kind of like not touched as much by the toxin, the base of the brain and the cerebrum located in the back of the brain, which aids in movement to the meat suit, would basically make you do this. The actual possibility of this, even with it being a relatively strange movie, is fairly interesting, because remember, there are plenty of compounds out there right now that plants produce that have a profound influence on our nervous system, whether that be stimulation or a depressing effect. In the case of this movie, plants having long been exposed to human shenanigans began developing a driving off chemical that likely became perfected over time. It's entirely possible that the plants were releasing a version of this chemical that had no effect on humans until finally it had a huge effect, which resulted in the misfiring of nervous systems, more specifically the central nervous system, that in the end would cause a person to potentially listen to portions of the brain not normally logical, and then they kind of ended themselves, which kind of makes you think, I wonder if that's what allergies are right now.